The Streets Speak: How Bangladesh's Youth Redefined Democracy. July 2024. The reintroduction of the quota system, a decision seen as a stark violation of dreams and a barrier to employment, ignited a firestorm through the streets of Dhaka. The students were simply demanding for reform of the quota system in government jobs, but the government tried to quell the student movement with violence. The air of the city was fogged with tear gas, and the streets were witnessing the crackdown on the innocent youth who dared to protest.
Bangladeshi youth are at the forefront of a movement they say aims to restore trust and hope in the country's future. Protests that started because of government job quotas have now morphed into a nationwide uprising against the ruling class in place there for the past 15 years.
As the crisis unfolded, the toll it took on humanity was immense. Over 758 people lost their lives, including 89 children and teenagers. Between July 16th and August 3rd alone, 341 souls were claimed by the violence, with another 417 deaths following in the weeks up to August 24th. People were killed, families were destroyed, and a nation was facing government's morality. This harsh crackdown turned a focused student protest into a nationwide movement when people from all walks of life joined in solidarity. On August 5, Monday, Bangladesh's former Prime Minister, Sheikh Hasina, left the country due to subsequent mass protests. Let's take a look at the events that led to the downfall of Sheikh Hasina. On July 2, 2024, a wave of protests swept through Dhaka. Students and young job seekers were demanding changes to the job quota system in government hiring, which reserved over half of the jobs for specific groups, including 30% just for freedom fighters' families. They said this was unfair and kept many qualified people from getting jobs based on their abilities. This wasn't the first time people had protested about this. Back in 2018, the government tried to remove these job quotas after similar protests. But then, children of freedom fighters challenged that decision, and the High Court brought the quotas back. This made the students even more frustrated. They didn't want to wait for more court decisions. They wanted action now. So they took to the streets again, hoping their voices would lead to real change this time. By July 10th, the protests had grown into the Bengal Blockade Program. Students filled the streets, sitting in at major intersections and blocking key highways throughout Dhaka. Their peaceful yet powerful actions caused massive traffic jams, disrupting daily life and drawing even more attention to their cause. On July 14th, tensions escalated further. At a press conference following her trip to China, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina addressed the students' grievance.
দ্বিতীয় কথাটা হচ্ছে মুক্তিযুদ্ধের বিরুদ্ধে এত ক্ষোভ কেন? মুক্তিযোদ্ধাদের নাতিপুতিরাও পাবে না, তাহলে কি রাজাকারের নাতিপুতিরা পাবে? সেটা আমার প্রশ্ন, দেশবাসীর কাছে প্রশ্ন, যে রাজাকারের নাতিপুতিরা সবকিছু পাবে, মুক্তিযোদ্ধারা পাবে না।
Her questioning remarks: why are they so angry with the freedom fighters? Will the freedom fighters' grandchildren get quota benefits, or will the Razakars' grandchildren get it? Struck a nerve. Her words felt personal to many students who saw them as a direct challenge. That night, fueled by frustration and a sense of injustice, students from various universities took to the streets in larger numbers. They marched through the darkness. I went to seek the right and became a Razakar. Their chants echoed through the night, a defiant response to what they perceived as an attack on their identity and rights. Tensions heightened on July 15th when government ministers and leaders criticized the students, labeling them as Razakars, a term historically associated with betrayal. Obaidul Quader, a senior leader of the Awami League and Minister of Road Transport and Bridges, warned that the Katra League, the student wing of the Awami League, would respond strongly to those who identified themselves with this controversial label. Later that day, the situation escalated dramatically at Dhaka University. Chhatra League activists clashed with anti-quota protesters, turning the campus into a battleground. The violence didn't stop at the university gates. It spilled over to Dhaka Medical College Hospital, where even injured students seeking medical attention were not spared. The clashes resulted in over 300 injuries, marking one of the darkest days of the protest. The violence continued to spread on July 16th, reaching Chittagong and Rangpur. Clashes there claimed the lives of at least 6 people. In a bold countermove, ordinary students at Dhaka and Rajshahi universities ousted Chhatra League members from their campuses, taking over their rooms in the university halls of residence. This act of defiance was a clear signal that the students were prepared to reclaim their space and fight for their rights. On July 17th, a somber atmosphere enveloped Dhaka, Rajshahi, and Jahangirnagar universities as students gathered to perform Gabi Janaza, a symbolic funeral prayer for their fallen peers. However, their mourning was met with aggression. Police disrupted these gatherings, further intensifying the unrest. The university authorities responded by shutting down campuses and ordering students to vacate their residences. The same day, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina addressed the nation. She expressed her grief over the violence that had occurred the day before and announced a judicial inquiry to hold those responsible accountable. She appealed to the students to remain patient, promising that the upcoming Supreme Court verdict on the quota system would address their concerns.
ছাত্রদের এগিয়ে দিচ্ছেন বিস্কুট পানি আর বলছেন কারো পানি লাগবে ভাই, পানি লাগলে নেন। কে জানতো মুগ্ধর ঝরে যাওয়া এই চোখের জলেই কাঁদবে পুরো দেশের মানুষ।
On July 19th, the violence escalated further. A metro rail station in Dhaka was engulfed in flames, and the Public Transport Authority's building was vandalized. That day, the conflict reached one of its darkest points, with at least 66 lives lost in clashes between the police and protesters. In Narsingdi, chaos unfolded as a jail was breached, and about 900 prisoners were freed. Firearms and ammunition were also taken. In response, the government imposed a nightly curfew and deployed the army to protect critical infrastructure and restore order. The following day, July 20th, saw no respite as the curfew's first day resulted in the deaths of at least 21 more people. The government extended the curfew indefinitely and declared a 2-day general holiday, hoping to calm the storm by arresting key activists and leaders of the quota movement. As dusk fell, Army troops patrolled the now quiet streets of Dhaka. On July 21st, the Supreme Court delivered its verdict, reducing the job quotas to 5% for children and descendants of freedom fighters, and 1% each for minorities and the physically challenged. Yet, even with the curfew still in place, 7 more lives were lost. By July 23rd, the government officially updated the quota allocations in accordance with the Supreme Court's decision. However, the movement's leaders rejected this too little, too late gesture, stating the cost in human lives was too great. Arrests continued, but a glimmer of normalcy returned as internet service was partially restored in some areas. As July neared its end, international pressure mounted. On July 25th, major global voices including the United States, Canada, the United Nations, and Amnesty International expressed deep concern over the ongoing crackdown. They urged an immediate cessation of hostilities. Amidst this international outcry, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina made a public appearance, visiting the charred remains of the metro rail station. Sheikh Hasina visited hospitals, showing her concern for those injured during the clashes, a gesture aimed at calming the public uproar. On July 27th, the international diplomatic community in Dhaka, including representatives from 14 Western countries, issued a joint letter demanding accountability for any abuse of power by law enforcement. This day also saw the arrest of 2 more movement organizers, indicating a continued crackdown on student leaders. Internet restrictions shaped much of the narrative on July 28th. While mobile internet was restored, strict controls on social media persisted, limiting information flow. Under pressure, 6 detained student leaders issued statements calling for an end to the protests. However, the spirit of defiance was far from broken, with many vowing to continue the fight. The unrest spread wider on July 29th as protesters filled streets across Bangladesh, reacting to harsh measures against their leaders. By July 30th, The movement saw a significant shift as teachers and parents joined the students on campuses across the nation, protesting not just the quota system, but also mourning the loss of life caused by police actions. On August 1st, the government escalated its response by banning Jamaat-e-Islami and its student wing, labeling them as terrorist organizations. Protests continued unabated on August 2nd, with demonstrators undeterred by the government's attempts to control the narrative and the streets. By August 3rd, the demands had crystallized. Protesters at a massive rally in Dhaka called for Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's resignation and the formation of a national government that could represent all factions. However, Hasina's offer to hold talks and form a 3-member committee, which was swiftly rejected. On August 4th, clashes intensified, spreading to at least 21 districts with devastating consequences. Media reports indicated that nearly 90 people, including 13 policemen, lost their lives in one of the deadliest days of the unrest. Then, on August 5th, the capital witnessed thousands of protesters from Dhaka and surrounding areas converged on the city, defying the curfew. Initially, the army attempted to block the crowds, but facing overwhelming numbers, they eventually withdrew. In a historic move that afternoon, overwhelmed by the persistent and widespread protests, Sheikh Hasina resigned. She and her sister fled to India, seeking refuge as the army chief announced the formation of an interim government, promised justice for those killed in the 20-day violent protests, and urged the crowd to calm down and go home. As the crowds began to disperse, a faction driven by anger targeted several significant buildings, including a museum dedicated to Bangladesh's founder, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. This act marked a bitter note. The events of these 20 days and sacrifices made by the protesters will forever be etched in the memory of the nation. Kailash Satyarthi once said, "The power of youth is the commonwealth for the entire world." This movement has proven just that. Now the future of Bangladesh rests in the hands of its youth, with a tangible hope as everyone looks forward to constructing a system that will suit best to the country, and hope that this movement will lead to lasting reforms that ensure equity, justice, and opportunity for every citizen of Bangladesh.